I've been kind of pushing to do this episode for a while. I'm interested to see if we can do this in a summer short, or if it actually is a much longer conversation. I am a big fan of kind of the first half of the series before everything was answered, and I think it's a really unique take on the idea of the cruelty of nostalgia. And I think we saw a lot of it after this franchise started, but I
Hmm.
think this was the start of the change in how we view horror, especially. I don't think it's a mistake that after this we got a whole bunch of Jordan Peele stuff. I don't think it's a mistake that we've kind of had a renaissance of anthology series like VHS. Um, I think the Five Nights at Freddy's series is it was the start of a new wave of horror that connected in a new way with people. And just to give people some context, it has only been since 2014. It has only been 8 years since Five Nights at Freddy's came on the scene, and
Hmm.
I do think it's probably one of the best indie horror series that
Yeah.
was created in the 2010s. I
Hmm.
would say. I would wager against many things. It's probably one of the best created. Then I don't know if it's the best in all history, but I think both in working with horror and nostalgia and the simple mechanic of fear and being trapped somewhere, it does some really exquisite work in an unexpected,
Yes.
almost taboo way. But a way that works really well with horror movies we see now, like Skinamarink, which is all about childhood and sleep paralysis and psychosis, and being locked in. And I just think it's both wonderfully exquisite and also frustratingly almost too lore driven. And I like how much it frustrates me as well as how good it is. Hello, Magnus. We're here to talk
Hello.
about Five Nights at Freddy's. I promise. I was going to let you say hello at some point.
It's quite all right. I know what it's like to get oneself into a point, and you just need to get that point out,
Yeah.
shall we say. So I suppose my opening remark should be, I don't think Five Nights really invented the nostalgia horror genre, but certainly it's shaped it significantly within even the less than a decade of its existence. And you can tell it has by the sheer amount of mascot horror clones that have flooded in its wake, of which I'm sure a lot of our listeners will know many of these. Poppy Playtime, Gardener Bam Bam. I could go on with the whole list, shall we say. Um, but the thing is, it's less than a decade into its existence, and it's already a household name. Even people that haven't played or seen the games, if you say Five Nights or Freddy's to them, I'm pretty sure that they'll know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And it's quite a success story in terms of that, in terms of like establishing an identity and a brand, and people know what you're talking about when they say the name.
Yeah.
Um,
What's
and
interesting
yeah,
what's interesting about that is that there are other horror genre video games, but for whatever reason, they didn't hit the same way. So you could think about the games like Clock Tower. You could think about games like Amnesia that are horror driven, where you were lost and you don't have a lot of details. You could even talk about things like the Outlast video games. But for some reason, when people like Markiplier and Jacksepticeye started playing these, more people became enamored with the world because it felt like you could ride along with it, I guess. Um, but Markiplier was also doing indie horror games long before Five Nights, even though he's king of Five Nights. So there's something about this particular series
yeah.
that just did something for people, you know?
You could almost argue it's interesting sort of like symbiotic relationship that's happened between YouTube Let's Players and Let's Player gamers in general, and this series. It's sort of they fed into each other and helped each other grow significantly. And
Yeah.
I do wonder what what channels like Markiplier, Game Theory, who's done about 70 theory episodes on Five Nights alone, what they would have looked like if Five Nights hadn't appeared
Yeah.
on the scene.
I don't think game theory would be around if they hadn't started doing Five Nights stuff. I can't imagine what else what other there's no other horror video game series that has such a deep and intense love of and hatred for lore. Because lore both expands the series and kind of ruins it at the same time. The demand for people having consistency, and poor Scott Cawthorne doing there was a couple of years where he was doing 2 games a year, which is
Mm,
just so much work. There's something about Five Nights at Freddy's that if it weren't just about the pizza establishment, I would almost think of Scott Cawthorne as a new sort of R.L. Stine, connecting terror and nostalgia and childhood to the
ah,
adult brain. But the
we're
problem
not
is
talking.
that R.L. Stine's work just expanded in a variety of universes. This is very like, even when it's not about the pizza place, it always comes back to the pizza place kind
Yeah,
of thing.
we're not talking about the freaking book series now, are we?
No, that is part of it, because that is a big part of the lore of the newer games, is that you're almost expected to know some of the lore from the books instead of the other way around now. But in it but what's really interesting is that I think about when I think about Scott Cawthorne, I also think about the output of what R.L. Stein did. I think a little bit about my love for Rod Serling, who created the Twilight Zone and Night Gallery, and using the anthology to get across a series of ideas. This is really very narrow, so Five Nights doesn't quite get Scott to those places, but you have like
Mhm.
Christopher Pike that did a very specialized niche genre series. I would also argue, I think for Five Nights at Freddy's, I connect with it because I have a love for Disney animatronics and Disney rides like the
Mhm.
Haunted Mansion and Pirates of the Caribbean, where you do have this almost not quite living, but you could see that if they walked around at night, you wouldn't be surprised sort of horror bent that Five Nights easily lends itself to. The first video game for me, even though it has the least successful jump scares, I think is just enough lore that's probably the most successful in the franchise for me. The introduction of the concept, it's not just unique at that point, but it's also an incredibly rare video game experience where you are trapped. It's a very simple mechanic, and you don't
Yes.
get lost in all the extras. It's you have to survive these 5 and then 6 nights without getting your face eaten off by living Chuck E. Cheese like creatures. It's so simple and it works so beautifully because it's like everything in your childhood you kind of suspected the Chuck E. Cheese characters were capable of, but
Something.
it's
Yeah.
made manifest, and I love that so
Mm.
much.
Well, that's the thing. Like, you're talking about like the first games as such, and you said you previously that you have a love for the first part of the series.
Yeah,
What's interesting? What's an interesting, or dare I say, academic viewpoint to take with this series? You can see in real time within the less of the span of this decade how it went from a new idea indie darling on the scene that grabbed people's attention, something like, as you say, it's simplistic, yet there's also something really like attention grabbing about it. You can
yeah,
see the transition from indie darling to mainstream saturated franchise. Like, and a lot of franchises take more time to transition to that, but you can almost see it happening game by game, the games become more active, they become more sleeker, you start to see, like, new mechanics and stuff added. You were almost seeing this, like, before Security Breach
Yeah.
landed.
I would argue you see it in Five Nights at Freddy's 4, which was supposed
Mm,
to be the final Five Nights at Freddy's game. For a long time, Scott said, "Hey guys, I'm getting burnt out. This is going to be the last one I do for a while." Um, the transition into 4, which is really driven more by the mini games and the lore and the little cutscenes than it is about the gameplay itself. And then 4 especially, you start to see it where the books and the lore don't just start to influence how the gameplay is created, but then
mm,
things happen later to go back and explain the thing that you see. And it goes from being weird and effortless and nightmare into just almost too much information. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 works because there's more information, but it also doesn't work because we're getting to the crux of too much.
mm,
Um, and the Five Nights at Freddy's 2 design, I don't think is
yeah,
good. The Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is where it starts to feel busy, but it's also where you get the more successful like take give cake to the children
mm,
mini game. So you have kind of like I think even in 2, Scott could see kind of the double edged sword coming, but I don't know if he
yeah.
knew how to avoid it. But Five Nights at Freddy's
Well,
1 is
mm,
such unexpected simplicity. It's a hit in the way something like Amnesia, Oblivion, and Outlast couldn't
mm,
be. It's going to have all of these predecessors later on, um, like not even like Poppy Playtime, but movies like Nicolas Cage and Willy's Wonderland, which does
mm.
like a horror action thing on it, and it's going to influence the VHS series later. Um, I loved when it was a fan revamp, and there was the one game that didn't get made, but it had that same feeling of the girl that's like going, she's doing like a paranormal ghost investigator things, and she sneaks into Five Nights at Freddy's, and she literally ends up in like the worst place to be at midnight in the Five Nights at Freddy's universe, which is the parts and services closet. And so the fans at some point, I think by sister location, even though it got silly, I think the fans at that point understood it better than the people that were in charge. Like it became a runaway success just a little too. And that's not to ding Scott, it's not to ding Still Wool, it's not to ding the Security Breach folks. Um, I think it's still a very serviceable brand, but you can see there's a lot of difference in the different games and kind of how much success can take a toll on a brand that may have not been made for success. I don't know Scott, so I don't know how much he thought people were going to love this game, but like there's a weight to Five Nights at Freddy's that I think may have sunk down Scott a little bit.
Well, I remember that this was going to be his last attempt at creating a successful game,
Yeah,
because he'd had lots of failures previously. So he decided to give it one last go, and he created Five Nights. So for a last attempt, it was a successful attempt.
yeah,
Um, he has made comments previously via avatars in the game and such of how he does agree that the lore is complicated, it gets heavy, it sometimes gets somewhat contradictory, and he asks people just to sort of take it with like a pinch of salt. Sometimes there's so much going on that to try and fit everything into a complete picture, it's just mind numbing. It's incredibly difficult, and it's not satisfactory when you're trying to force like everything into a square hole, so to
yeah,
speak. And to be honest, that's kind of real life, to be honest, as well. Not everything is going to make sense, and you're never going to have the complete picture. But humans have this, I forget what exactly it's called. It's the syndrome behind completionism, We got to feel we can make everything orderly, that we make everything fit, all the facts line up, and sadly for Five Nights, it's got people so invested in the lore, they need that perfect cake.
I actually, so what I loved about Five Nights at Freddy's 2, when we
Mm,
first got our first mini game, was that the lore left people talking and it didn't decide. And I kind of
yeah.
liked that because there's something about a kid's perspective in seeing events that's different than adults' perspective.
Mm,
So
yes.
actually, I prefer when the Lord didn't answer any questions and it was like something we were talking about. There was a communal aspect to it. It felt the way you felt when you read your first Goosebumps book and you like brought it to the other
Mm,
kids on the playground. I do think originally the mini games were pretty genius. They were unexpected. You had to hunt for them. Even when you saw Markiplier playing them or anything like that, it really felt like you were discovering something. Um, but it didn't take away from the main crux of the franchise, which was this dilapidated pizza establishment and all of these things that were coming alive that just aren't supposed to come alive. Just
yeah.
the idea of this terrifying golden brown bear in a top hat just coming after you and screaming at you and murdering you. The fan love for Foxy the pirate
Mhm.
themed fox that lives in Pirate Cove. Um, Even in the first game, the first time everyone saw the posters change, where they show Freddy's head coming off, but it's like a secret thing you only get if you do the secret thing. That's
Yeah.
effective storytelling. And it felt like both there was never an attempt at recreating it, but that there was an attempt that Scott was pushed into that didn't pan out as well because it doesn't feel as organic. I don't think it's bad. I think you
Mm,
can see it in Five Nights at Freddy's 3, where he's really trying to wrestle the series back, where he's like, yes, it's a horror game, so let's set it in a horror world. But it just feels like they were trying to push Scott into something that by the time we get to like the RPG one,
yeah.
the RPG spinoff,
Mhm.
that he's like really wrestling with the success of something that got away from him a little bit. Almost it would have been better
Yeah.
if it had only been like a thing only a few people knew about it and it was just enough to pay the bills and we got
Yeah.
like one every 2 years. Like I can only imagine that
Mm.
version of Five Nights at Freddy's.
Well, the thing is, to create something of quality and that has, that has everything really working well for it, a person needs time to work on those ideas. They need time to make everything make sense. It does, as you say, it does feel that Scott was on a minecart and it was gathering speed and it was gathering pace. And y yes, you were getting all of this success and all this interest thrown your way, but is there any way to really slow down the cart enough to give you that chance to really polish everything? Um, there was something about I forget, when was the Pizza Simulator game? Was that
Uh
6
that's
or 5?
2017 and that is 6. Pizza Simulator
6.
is 6, yeah.
Now, from a narrative perspective, I think Scott always knew how he wanted to finish the Five Nights at Freddy's story. There's a sense of finale and closure there. However, I get the feeling that even though he had the basic ideas down pat, that, you know, that you said that was 2017, right? That
Yeah,
with that with the Pizza
2017,
Simulator,
yeah.
6 games in 3 years, basically, and
That's
all the
insane.
additional projects.
Yeah.
Like, there's no way that everything is gonna be 100% ready to function. And I do love that conclusion. I think it narratively, it's fantastic, and I love what they did with it, but I really feel for the guy.
Yeah. I don't think any of the games on their own are so bad that you should throw them away. I think they all have
No.
interesting elements. If we didn't get Sister Location, we don't get Circus Baby, so we don't hear about Elizabeth and the ice cream
Yeah.
grabbing animatronic that will eat you from inside out by any means. Yeah.
3 really introduced Springtrap and such and set up a lot of stuff there and made it quite an iconic, mascot villain, but I
Yeah.
think 3 might be the weakest gameplay-wise and narratively. It really does feel like a connection between 2 to 4 and 5.
Yeah. I think three was trying hard to hold on to the elements of stationary. And it's
Yeah,
after three we really start to see the idea of wandering, which
yes.
now we see in Security Breach. It's come full circle, really.
Yeah,
Um, I
mm,
liked three as a concept because I liked the idea of this is a hallucination. It's all in your mind. These are broken. This is a broken down world because in one it's dilapidated, but it's just like kind of weird and funky at night. In two, things are getting closed down. Three is like full fledged horror game, and I think if
mm,
you did Five Nights at Freddy's 3 as its own film, a la like Funhouse or something, that it would work, and that might be kind of the vibe of the film.
mm.
It's hard to say. The film is they've been trying to make this damn film for like 4 years. So
Oh,
I'm glad Matthew Lillard is
if
on
we're
board because I have some faith. But like they've been trying to make this film for a long damn time.
Okay, if we're gonna just briefly touch on the film in this part, I'm
Yeah,
gonna get it out of my system. My one of my little crushes, Josh Hutcherson, is here, and yeah,
yeah.
I'm sorry, I
He
know
was
it's
great in
typical to
Future Man.
be.
I'm looking forward to seeing him do it. Like I think he'll be a great Mike or Phil or whatever his character's name
Yeah,
is.
I
Yeah.
know it's typical of me to bring out the boys and such, but I don't know why. I've just had a long-standing crush on his sort of soulful, at times melancholy face and attitude, and I just he's just the sort of boy you want to take in a hug and gently pat his hair and, you know, before
That's
everything else.
nice. That's nice. Yeah, so the movie is coming. Ruin, which is the
Yeah.
DLC for Security Breach that I have been watching the plays of these happen. I'm not going to spoil them because that has been a request. But
Mhm,
I've been watching them and I am pleasant. I feel pleasant about it. I will say I find them very pleasant. Um, I there are some great parts of brilliance in the new part of Five Nights at Freddy's. I'm thinking specifically of the Curse of Dreadbear, the Help Wanted Halloween
mm,
DLC, where you get specific Halloween themed versions of your favorite characters. Um, I remember Five Nights at Freddy's 2, the first time we saw, gonna forget the name, female Foxy, the one that is the different things the
oh,
kids were putting together.
a
Um,
mangle.
Mangle. I thought Mangle was a genius idea and a great
Mm,
direction to take Foxy in. It didn't occur to me they would be their own separate character. So, like, every game has its own specific thing. If you want humor, Sister Location gives you that along with the horror. It gives you the exotic
mm.
butters and that weird ongoing soap opera thing. It does leave you unsettled, but Sister Location, especially for me, I know that Markiplier likes that game, Astral Spiff likes it, and Pizza Simulator. But for me, Sister Location is really, if four was Scott feeling like I really want to end the series now, Sister Location was like someone coming in to tell him, no, you need to make us $20 million. So get as close as you can. I don't think it's bad. There are some good things in it. It's an interesting way to approach the series, but it doesn't really
Mm,
feel. It feels like you cross more because it always felt, even though it was an animatronic science fictiony type of series, it always did feel more dilapidated horror, a little bit of neo gothic, very much like broken down suburbia. Sister Location has really started to move it more in the sci-fi direction. And we see that
yeah. Y
happening more in Help Wanted. We see it in Security
y
Breach.
yeah.
It's not bad, but it crosses a line you can't go back onto necessarily.
Yeah, you've gone from closed-in, dilapidated spaces to Sister Location, which is clearly an active, functioning company, which is going out to parties and such. And there's clearly like shenanigans going
Yeah,
on here. And so you're in a way, you've gone from in the aftermath of the tragedies that have happened previously, and you're very much sort of in the midst of it going on.
I also don't think, as far as villainous intent goes,
Mm.
in the books especially, I get the sense from the book. I haven't really read the book, so I could be wrong, but I get the sense from the books influence the idea to go from it being about individual characters trapped in suits to being this like soul light remnant thing that then becomes like
Oh,
living
with
but isn't.
yeah.
And it's too
Uh,
much. It's too much for my little brain.
oh,
Like if I was 8 years
the-
old, I'd be like,
yeah.
nope, and I'm done. End scene.
Oh,
That's all for me.
it's not just remnant anymore. Now you've got anger or resentment. You've got two types of soul energy that's
Yeah,
affecting
but
things, and like,
I liked it when it was just, holy crap, there are bodies in these suits. That's bad. They're coming to eat me. Like the simplicity of the first four villainous animatronics. And then you get the marionette in two, and you get the understanding of who the marionette is. In two, it's very sad. You get three, where you get Springtrap back as Scrap Trap, and you get the weirdness of Balloon Boy, but then you get to four and you start to get the monster versions, and then it gets retconned later that the monster versions are really important, or it's in the first book. Um, I loved the
so
idea of the series, and it just bothers me that it feels like it got away from authorial
it,
intent. I don't think
it
it's
got too busy.
bad, but it did. It's not. I just remember in 2014 when Five Nights at Freddy's 1 came out, and
Mm.
it had this really new special energy, and I had been feeling people really gravitate to how can we take nostalgia and bring it into horror and make it very special. And I had seen it a little bit, but I'd never seen anything like Five Nights at Freddy's doing this, because it was almost the taboo of, we don't want to do something that we can't take back, because Five Nights is really the nth degree of what happens when Chuck E. Cheese fails. What happens when this thing that we loved as a kid, that feels safe and enthusiastic, really goes dark and shadowy. And so it feels kind of like a taboo of, once you've crossed that line, you can't come back from it. But then you can't keep crossing lines, and eventually you have to be like, I'm good. This is where the masterpiece ends, you know? And I
Mm.
don't think it's all Scott's fault, by any
No.
stretch of the imagination. He's one man, and like some of the fans
Well,
that were bad actors that were leaking stuff and were
mm.
like, I cannot even imagine that unprecedented level of success. I hope to imagine it someday. I hope it won't ruin me. Um, yeah, it's not to say they're completely bad games by any stretch, but like looking
Yeah.
at one versus Security Breach, they're so different.
So, mm. So something I was thinking just well, first of all, I'll say my wacky idea I've just had, and then I'm gonna mention something about security breach. What would you feel like a Five Nights at Freddy's like sort of rock horror musical? Like over the top phonetic energy, like Rocky Horror sort of
I mean,
thing.
it
Uh,
can't be any worse than Starlight Express was. I actually think you could do, because there is a really great musical they made for Evil Dead, and they made a Carrie musical, which isn't as good. But like, if you can make a musical for Evil Dead, you can make a musical for Five Nights. I think nostalgia would work in its favor, because even within Five Nights at Freddy's, there is nostalgia. All the music we hear in Five Nights at Freddy's 1, especially the Toreador song, is a real famous remix of a
mm.
very famous old song. It has like an ice cream truck feel to it. So yeah, you could totally do it. There's absolutely no reason you couldn't make this into a rock musical that frightens a soul. It would probably be very Lion King, and it would use a lot of puppets, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
But I see no reason why it wouldn't work.
Mhm. So I have a question for you. Um, have you seen in the last couple of years the interest around the back rooms and spatial horror?
Yeah, I really liked it. Actually, what I loved is the idea of using spatial horror as philosophy. So there was a game that Markiplier played called Perspective, or
Mm.
something like that, where it had a backroom feel, but you were solving a philosophical question of what happens when you can't sleep. So I really
Yeah.
like that. Yeah,
So Five Nights 1 to 5, they were indoors, they were sort of claustrophobic. you were kind of trapped within what was familiarness to you with nostalgia, but now has turned dark and run down and such. Um, Five Nights Security Breach tried to take it in a different direction, again trapping you in somewhere nostalgic, but there was so much open space. I feel what they were trying to achieve with it didn't work, but if they found a way to incorporate a sort of Backrooms-esque horror of the familiar, but also at the same time taking it so familiar and then twisting it that it becomes unsettling, that might have been a
Yeah.
great way to take it.
I also do think William Afton represents kind of that 80s, late 80s, early 90s when everyone was doing Satanic Panic and Stranger
Mhm.
Danger stuff. William Afton does represent that iconic brand of villain that you don't expect. I think if this had
Mm,
been done as a film, TV, or film or TV miniseries, I could see William Afton in the first three stories being very much like a Michael Myers type character.
yeah.
Unfortunately, now we know so much about him that it's almost too much and he's too human. But there was a time where I thought that Springtrap was going to overtake like I felt like the fans had the sense of justice and that Springtrap as a villain was becoming so iconic. He was actually overtaking Freddy as the brand.
Mm,
To be honest. And I missed Foxy too. I missed after it like after the third game when Foxy becomes like less of a thing, you don't see him as much.
yeah.
And it's no ding against Monty Gator and things like that. I like the idea of a gator wearing sunglasses. But for me, the breakout star was really Foxy, and then Freddy was kind of the head keeping the world together. But
Yeah.
at some point, all of the side characters started to eclipse Freddy, and
Mm,
Freddy's back in control in Security Breach, but it doesn't feel like he's in control of the world anymore in a way. I don't know if that makes
no.
sense. It made more sense in my head as I was
It
thinking it.
no, no, it makes sense. I mean, the game is Five Nights at Freddy's, and Freddy in the first game was the main threat. The other band members were, his bandmates, not,
Yeah,
the lead stars and such. Whereas Freddy in this game became your sidekick to your annoying little vulnerable kid character,
it's
or your
true.
walking tank. Um, I want so in terms of like threat and like you mentioned about Afton and such,
Yeah.
well, they've introduced the concept of the hellish afterlife in this thing, and Afton's been dragged down to it. There's nothing to say that he won't be transformed into an evil demonic monster that comes back to terrorize children.
But here's the thing, though: is in one, two, and three, it felt more present. It felt like he was clawing his way out of hell back into the suit that he was damned to walk in. It had a very almost Mr. Freeze from Batman, where he's kind of trapped, and the trap of the suit is what's actually keeping him in
Mm,
check. And that's something that's really like because they made him the hypervillain of the series, and we know so much more about him, and he's still the main villain, but it's almost better in this case not to know.
mm,
And it's something that once you know, you can't really take away the knowledge. So even watching the
yeah.
old videos back now
Mm,
it's like, oh, that was something that's going to get retconned. Oh, that is something that's not going to matter. Oh, that's something we're never going to see again. Um, I was really excited for Security Breach. The other part of it is that Security Breach had so many bugs in its release that like
mm,
it made gameplay hard. And
yeah.
that was the
Oh,
first
and
time that had really happened in the series that I knew of. And that was
yeah,
difficult to watch the fall from grace just on a playability
yeah,
level.
and also the bad gameplay mechanic design with the end with the
Yeah.
after 6 a.m. function. Christ they managed to sort that out. But
Yeah.
yeah, it really did screw
Yeah.
itself up a little bit, sadly.
Yeah. So, do you have anything? Do you have anything you want to say as we kind of reach the end of the conversation on Five Nights as a French the Five
Mm.
Night franchise, as it were?
Um, I would say that I'm quite excited to see where it goes in the future. We are going to be having the 10th anniversary next year. They seem to be ramping up for a few surprises with it. It's been interesting to have sort of lived from the start of what was it was the start of like a really popular franchise that's just kept going. I don't think it's going to run out of steam for quite some time,
Yeah.
to be honest.
I
So
would love to
where
work on it. Like if they
yeah.
like what I do, like call me, I'll still work on it. And
Rock horror,
I do think
opera.
characters like Sundrop and Moondrop are really interesting. I
Yeah,
think for pure nightmare fuel, even in Ruin, if you see them in Ruin, I'm not going to spoil it, but if you see them in Ruin, just the idea of them in a ruined state, going
yeah.
from already these almost demonic vulture entities into that is really great. There were some things I loved. I actually really liked the brazen sci-fi neon almost art deco 80s feel of Security Breach. It was just the gameplay really got in the way of the success of that game. um I like the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise. I wouldn't say I'm obsessed with it by any stretch.
No.
It's certainly not going to overtake something like Little Shop of Horrors, where
Mm,
the puppet style is so important to the story. But I think Five Nights at Freddy's as neo horror is up there with what Jordan Peele has done. It's very different, of course, but it's really up there with how we approach how we tell horror stories in a world where the scariest thing is where we live, to be perfectly honest. The scariest thing is people in power. But like when I think about Five Nights at Freddy's, it's on not quite the same level in a different way, but it's on that level of with the things that Jordan Peele uses to wrestle with, in
mm,
especially in Us, where it's such an unexpected callback to things that you don't even expect. Um, and I'm excited to see where the series goes as well.
mm.
For all the critique, I'm still tuning in to the series. I just don't have very much of the merchandise because why would I want a demonic teddy bear in my house? Like, why? Um, but ours is to why, and next time we will why more on Everything is Gay, Even the Straight Stuff. I think we'll be back with longer form episodes soon when we have another summer short. But we'll see, and we'll see you next time on Everything is Gay, Even the Straight Stuff.
Ta-da! Bye.
Ta-da, bye.